Hello and welcome along. So in this video we're going to continue the series on looking at the lives of the Primarchs before they were reunited with the Emperor. And in this episode it's Rabuti Guilliman. Now the early life of Guilliman is quite different to a lot of the other Primarchs, mainly because Macragge is quite a different world to the worlds that many of the other Primarchs landed on. You could say were very unfortunate to land upon. So many of the Primarchs landed on death worlds, so worlds that are so inhospitable that everything about that world is difficult to deal with. The climate, the animal life, the plant life, everything. It is toxic wastelands, man-eating jungles, ferocious monsters of every kind you can imagine. Basically Australia. Now, Macragge, on the other hand, is very different. It's a world that has managed to maintain a relatively ordered society, a relatively organised society. It had a somewhat oppressive government, nothing excessively bad. Again, many of the other Primarchs landed on worlds which had extremely oppressive governments, worlds that, although they were relatively well organised and ordered, and were not death worlds, they weren't constantly trying to kill you, they were very oppressive, and the people that lived there had terrible lives. And the Primarchs that landed there were, of course, influenced by those very difficult circumstances that the citizens of these worlds had to deal with. But on Macragge, generally the citizens had a pretty reasonable life, and the worlds had maintained a relatively high level of technology. In fact, Macragge had even maintained some spacecraft and the ability to travel within the warp. Relatively short journeys, but still they had warp-capable craft. So they had maintained some contact with worlds in other systems, which gave them a different perspective than many other worlds that the Primarchs landed on. It gave them the knowledge of that they weren't the only ones out there. There were other human societies out there amongst the stars, and that had an influence on their view of the world, and of course it had an influence on Guilliman himself as he grew up in that society. Now, another big difference for Guilliman is because he landed on a world that was pretty well ordered and had a pretty organised society. There was quite a lot of record keeping, documentation, and so Guilliman's early life is much more reliably recorded than many of the other Primarchs. So much more about it is known, and it can be trusted a little bit more than many of the other Primarchs' early life histories. Now, of course, it is the Imperium, and so many of the records would have been adjusted and so massaged to make them more favourable to the Primarch and also to the wider Imperium. So in many ways, Guilliman's story would have been used as an example of what a Primarch is and what the Imperium brings to the citizens of the Imperium. In many ways, Guilliman's early life and what he's supposed to have done and achieved is kind of mirroring what the Emperor is doing for wider humanity, and so it's used as an example to give to people of why the Imperium is good and why people should support it. And so you have to bear that in mind when you listen to Guilliman's story, because although, yes, it is pretty consistent and well recorded, it still doesn't mean it's 100% reliable, because the Imperium was, and always has been, very apt at using propaganda and spin to try and present themselves and the important people amongst the Imperium as being on the right side. So the story goes that Connor Guilliman, who was the co-ruler of the largest state on Macragge Civitas, so basically the largest city, was out hunting with nobles of Macragge and found the pod which contained Guilliman shortly after it had landed. So Guilliman, unlike some of the other Primarchs, wasn't wandering around on his own for a long period of time. He was found as a baby inside the pod still. And again, unlike many of the other Primarchs, he was found by people who understood technology, and so when they saw the pod, they didn't think it was some miracle or some magical being. They just thought, this is an interesting piece of technology. Let's have a look inside. Oh, look, there's this child with a golden aura shining off of it, who is a perfect image of what you would imagine a human child could be. They didn't think immediately, well, should we kill this strange creature? They thought, oh, okay, let's adopt him. Now, Connor, being the most powerful amongst the group, decided that he would adopt this child. And you can imagine the others probably didn't have much choice in this, but if the king, well, effectively the king, the co-ruler, who's consul of your country, says, I'm going to adopt this child, you're not going to say, no, I'm going to adopt him. Obviously, he gets first dibs. And he decided that this young Guilliman looked like a great prospect to be his son and heir, and it was common amongst his society to adopt heirs based on their abilities and so on. So you could pass on all you've built up and so on to someone worthy rather than random chance of your own child who probably turns out to be a bit of a knob. So he thought, well, this angelic looking child that's come out of this pod of obvious high technology is probably a good bet for me to adopt. So he does that, takes him back to the city where he raises him. And of course, he's a powerful ruler, not the ruler of all of Macragge, but very important amongst the leadership of Macragge, and probably the most powerful man on Macragge, equally with his co-consul, Guilliman. And he gives Guilliman a great life. He grows up in a palace, he grows up with all the best teachers that the world can give him. He is taken care of and educated, etc. And very quickly he learns all that he can learn from these people because he has the mind of a Primarch, of course. And even amongst the Primarchs, he's a very quick learner and someone who finds things very easy to understand and to memorize. So he has a perfect memory. He has incredibly high level of ability to understand information and organize it in his mind so that he can use it and so on. He in many ways, Guilliman is very similar to Perturabo. What Guilliman lacks, which Perturabo has, is the ability to think outside the box. He's very much an inside-the-box man, much like Dawn. But inside the box, he has total mastery of everything. He doesn't have that little bit of genius, that ability to go beyond the conventional that Perturabo has. That's what makes Perturabo better than Guilliman. But of course, what Guilliman doesn't have is all the deep resentment and bitterness that Perturabo has from either a combination of his chaos corruption and his upbringing, which was kind of the opposite of what Guilliman gets on Macragge. Guilliman's real talents lie in military organisation, and this is recognised relatively early on Macragge because he seems to excel in everything, but he's particularly interested in military organisation, and so he's given a command to go on an expeditionary mission by Connor and to deal with an area of Macragge that is always been the most difficult part, the most rebellious and difficult to control, full of bandits and brigands, etc. This is Illyrium, and this region will go on to be a continuous problem for the other people of Macragge and for Guilliman himself, all the way up to the heresy. So Guilliman is sent by his adopted father on his first mission to basically say, I trust you to go and deal with this problem we've got. Go and sort them out. And he heads off, and of course, being a Primarch and being Guilliman, he does do it. He conquers them very easily. He kind of leads the perfect campaign, defeating them militarily, and returns in triumph back to Macragge Civitas. However, when he arrives back, he notices that the city's on fire. There's people fleeing the city. There's clearly been some sort of terrible event has occurred. So as he gets closer, people start to tell him what's happened. And it turns out that, lo and behold, Galen, the co-consul, has launched a coup against Guilliman's adopted father, Connor, and has tried to take over the whole of the city for himself. He wants to rule without sharing power with Connor. Now, the reasons for this are a little bit deeper than just, I want to be in charge, I don't want to share this. Connor has introduced many reforms to Macragge society, and he is very much closely aligned with the industrialists of Macragge Civitas. These are the sort of the merchants who have grown powerful and influential and popular with the people because they introduce various changes to society to help the poorer people, to educate them, give them more access to technology, and help them generally have better lives, as opposed to the aristocrats who were the traditional leaders of Macragge, or who are the close supporters of Galen, who want to keep the populace down, want to keep them uneducated, and keep their access to knowledge and technology as low as possible so that they can be controlled and used. So Connor is very popular with the industrialists and most of the general population, whereas Galen is very popular with the aristocrats, who are the traditional wealthy of Macragge. And this has led to an inevitable clash of ideals. And on top of this, Galen is jealous of and somewhat afraid of Connor's possession of this prodigy child, Rabute, who he fears will eventually be impossible to deal with. This is also similar to Perturabo's story. Of course, the fact that his father had Perturabo in his arsenal made his rivals more afraid of him, but it also made them more anxious, more determined to get rid of him and early, because they could see the longer they left it, the harder it would be to deal with this growing Primarch. And so there's kind of a two-edged sword having a Primarch as your understudy or your adopted child. And so Guilliman's reached this point where he's understood what's going on, and he realizes his father's life is on the line. He could well be killed by Galen. He doesn't know if he's alive or dead. He needs to get to him quickly. So he fights his way through these rebels, and he does have the advantage of being at the head of a conquering army that has just been successful on campaign and are very loyal to him because they've witnessed how good he is in the field. And so they help him retake the city. He fights his way through to find his father, and unfortunately he's on death's door. So he's able to see him before he dies, but he isn't able to save him. Now, he then is pretty angry at this point at Galen's betrayal, of course, which kind of foreshadows Horus's betrayal of the Emperor. So Connor being the surrogate father, and also his mentor and so on, who is now inexplicably betrayed for trying to make the world a better place by his closest ally, Galen, much like the Emperor is betrayed by Horus, who everyone thought it was impossible he could betray the Emperor, etc. So there's quite a lot of foreshadowing there. And so, of course, Guilliman is out for revenge, and he goes and finds all of the conspirators, kills them all, or at least most of them. He kills all the high-ranking conspirators, has them hung in the street, etc., including Galen. He then imprisons, essentially, the lower-level rebels and puts them into hard labour camps where they have to rebuild the city that they've tried to destroy, leading to pretty short lives as they die off through hard manual labour that is essentially a death sentence to them. Now, once he's won, which was reasonably easy for him, being a Primarch at the head of a very well-organised army that's just won a campaign against a disorganised mob of thugs who were paid by the aristocracy to cause trouble, they weren't going to take much defeating. It wasn't so much a brilliant military campaign that won this, just so much as, I have a professional army and you don't, I win. So he takes control of the city, and then he basically takes the reforms that Connor was putting into place to another level, and he just keeps going. And so he expands the industrialization of Macragge, and he continues to increase the quality of life of the average person on Macragge. He spreads out the wealth and the access to technology. He essentially greatly improves everybody's lives, except for the aristocrats who were hoarding the wealth, who are now all dead, except for a few who, so we say, shared his more enlightened views and quickly got on board with his program of improvements. Some, to be fair, hadn't taken part in the coup. They actually supported Connor. They were on Guilliman's side from the start. They remained as part of the leadership of Macragge under Guilliman. And Guilliman took on essentially the power of both consuls. He united all the power under himself. He became, in effect, the king of Macragge, or emperor, you might say. And for all accounts, he's done a great job. He greatly improved everyone's lives. He massively increased the industrial output of Macragge, and he united the planet as one under his rule. And he created what is said to be a perfect meritocracy, where only your abilities and character could get you promoted. And so Macragge flourished under this new regime. Now, of course, this is the ideal. This is essentially the imperial truth without the Emperor. This is what the Emperor is supposed to be doing to the galaxy, and in a microcosm. So how real this actually was is hard to say, because really it's just being put out there as an example of what the Imperium can give you if you accept the Imperium as your overlords. And as we know, that the Imperium did not do this universally to those people that it took into the Imperium. And many of the people's lives within the Imperium, even during the time of the Great Crusade when the Emperor was around, were not great, and often led to huge resentment against the Imperium, as their natural resources were sucked out of the planets and their peoples were forced into huge factories just to work and toil away, producing weapons and ammunition for the Great Crusade and so on. They certainly didn't experience the utopia that they were told they were going to get from the Imperium. And so this story about what Guilliman did to Macragge is probably quite embellished to make it sound better than it was. And we know that certainly Macragge was not perfectly run or perfectly united or perfectly happy, because that same region, Illyrium, that Guilliman was supposed to have conquered perfectly and integrated into Macragge perfectly, was still a hotbed of rebellion 200 years later when the heresy happens. And in fact requires the Lion to commit crimes against humanity to bring it under control, literally using banned weapons to destroy the population, to virtually destroy the population, to bring them under control. And it's said throughout the story of Imperius Secundus, when this is happening, that this region has remained rebellious and difficult to control for Guilliman from the very beginning. So he hasn't actually established this perfect utopia that is talked about in his origin story, but he probably has to a certain extent for most of the people of most of Macragge, but it's not perfect. Now, during the Great Crusade, the Emperor has reached a point where he is nearby in a neighbouring system and hears about this special child of Connor, Guilliman, and he immediately recognises, well, this has got to be one of my Primarchs, and decides he's going to go and get them. Now, we don't really know why the Emperor is here, because it's right out on the Eastern Fringe. He shouldn't already be there. The Great Crusade hasn't reached this point yet, so it's plausible and probably likely that he's, for some reason, knows that there's someone out here, maybe using his psychic abilities or something. He has predicted that there will be a Primarch here, so he's gone out there. He's had this intuition confirmed by the people of neighbouring systems, and he decides, well, I'm going to go to Macragge to get my son. So he goes there, but unfortunately for him, massive warp storms erupt, and he's unable to get there. So this is about the time that Guilliman is going off on his first military mission, and this gives him time, essentially 5 years, to put down the rebellion and build Macragge into this perfect world that the Emperor would find when he actually eventually meets Guilliman. And it also gives him time to build up his military, organise it, and start to plan and, in fact, enact a conquest of the neighbouring systems. So he has built up a relatively small but an empire in space, controlling several worlds when the Emperor eventually gets to see him, which is, of course, quite impressive, much more than most of the Primarchs have done by the time the Emperor meets them. So the Emperor arrives, Guilliman meets him, they essentially both have a mutual understanding of what's going on. The Emperor fills Guilliman in on some details, and Guilliman immediately like, well, okay, you're in charge, I swear loyalty to you, you're my Emperor. So Guilliman has basically predicted what he is. He knows he's some sort of created super being designed to lead armies, etc., by somebody else, and he knows that somebody else will probably come and get him one day. Exactly the same way as Perturabo felt about the Emperor when he was found. He'd already worked out what he was and was just waiting for the Emperor to turn up. Well, someone to turn up who turned out to be the Emperor. And so Guilliman did exactly the same thing as Perturabo, just accepted what happened and carried on doing what he already was going to do, but now in the name of the Emperor, and with Macragge and Ultramar, this sort of proto-empire he was building as part of the Imperium. But so for the Emperor's part, he was probably just glad to see that one of his sons wasn't a psychopath. And so just let him get on with it and just said, okay, carry on doing what you're doing. Went off back to the main thrust of the Great Crusade. What does this say about Guilliman and his relationship with the Emperor? Well, the thing is, first of all, he had it easy, very easy. Let's be honest, he had it very easy compared to most of the other Primarchs. He had a nice world to land on, he had nice people to deal with most of the time, he had a very easy first experience as a military leader. He had the perfect scenario to take over his world where he wouldn't be laboured with the guilt of killing his own father or foster father, if you like. And he had an enemy to focus on in this Galen, in a very just way. He could take control of the planet. And he had a people that loved him because his father had set everything up for him to be loved. And he had a world with functioning technology and organization and even access to other planets. So it was all there for him. When he meets the Emperor doesn't try to make him change anything, doesn't try to take control of his world. He doesn't try to take him away from his world, say, no, you've got to come back to Terra, leave this alone. We'll take care of this while you're gone. We'll just put an Imperial Governor in charge. And oh, by the way, the Mechanicum are going to land massive factories on your planet and suck it dry of resources. Your people are going to be turned into essentially slaves. None of those things happen. There's no military threat or implicit threat of what's going on. There's no need for any of this. Now, partly that's because Guilliman is everything the Emperor wants from his son, so he doesn't need to do any of those things. So you could say that, well, that's because Guilliman's better than many of the other Primarchs as a person, and so he was able to integrate into the Imperium much more easily. You could also say the Emperor did treat him better than most of the other Primarchs, and so there was less chance for him to become a rebellious son or to become disillusioned by the Imperium and so on, because he had essentially complete control over what happened in Ultramar. He had to make very little, almost no concessions for actually becoming part of the Imperium. So there you go. That's the story of Roboute Guilliman before the Emperor. Let me know what you think in the comments. It's great to hear from you as always. If there's a particular Primarch you'd like me to talk about next time, please say so, because I'll be planning the next video soon. And of course, if there's any other topics you'd want me to talk about, say so as well. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.